Hey guys, it's Celestia, and today we're going to be talking about layers. I tried to find a way to start this with a Shrek onion reference as some kind of vaguely funny cold open, but it's been a very long week and I'm tired and not nearly as funny as I'd like to think I am, so I'm just going to put this expertly crafted image on screen instead, and we can all pretend I actually put in the effort to make a good joke. Pause for laugh? Great. I'm good at my job. As I'm sure the digital artists amongst you have already guessed, when I say layers, I am not talking about onions or the intricate, delicate, emotional depths of an ogre that's almost as jaded and bitter as I am. I mean art layers. I know digital artists are not the only artists in my audience, nor do all digital artists actually use layers, so for the sake of my traditional art squad and anyone else who might not know, let me give you the quickest rundown I can. Layers are a digital art feature present in most, if not all, prominent major art programs. Procreate, Paint Tool Sci, Photoshop, Medibang, Clip Studio Paint, they all offer their users the ability to utilize layers in their projects. Beginning with the first base layer, artists can create more and more layers on top of that appear to be simply drawn over the entire piece, but actually only affect whatever you draw on that layer alone and not anything above or below it. Clip Studio Paint describes them simply and succinctly as, effectively, a stack of transparent sheets of paper. Imagine that you've painted a background in your sketchbook and then a character on a transparent sheet of paper. You can move the transparent sheet around on top of the background you drew in your sketchbook and therefore place the character anywhere you want in that environment, but you're not actually affecting the background at all because you're not drawing directly on it, giving you more freedom to revise that placement until it adequately suits your preferences. Layers in digital art programs are fundamentally the same, except there's a near infinite number of them available to you depending on your device's storage and the program you're using, and they are vastly easier to use than that. And based on that description alone, I'm sure it comes as no surprise to hear that digital artists everywhere love them. They let you add to a piece without affecting everything you've already drawn, meaning that if you make a mistake or don't like the way that addition looks, you can simply remove the layer and have the layers beneath it remain safely untouched. Many artists view these as long-term undo states, where they can experiment with different techniques on top of their base art without committing to anything, because they can just delete those layers if they end up not liking how they turn out. Others take advantage of the blending modes and clipping masks they offer, something I'll explain more later, which allow artists to render more quickly and effectively, apply color corrections and adjustments, add textures and effects, and so much more. Artists with less interest in the more complex uses of layers simply reap the benefits of being able to keep their sketches, line art, and colors all separate from each other. Regardless of where you fall on that spectrum in terms of your personal layer use preferences, the bottom line is that their value and versatility can't be overstated. They make the art creation process vastly easier, and remove a lot of the anxiety that results from the pressure artists would otherwise have felt to avoid making any mistakes that would have been permanent without layers. They're so helpful, in fact, that many of us are so drawn in by the many benefits they offer that we end up using a lot of them. For a lot of us, far too many. See, the longer I spend drawing, the more I come to realize that for all of their many perks, layers are kind of a double-edged sword. I'm someone who has always used too many of them personally. In recent years, I've been putting a significant amount of effort into reducing the numbers of layers I use in each piece, but all that really means is that I've gone from using upwards of 200 per piece to maybe 60 to 70. Less, sure, but still way too many. And you may be wondering, okay, that's a lot, but is that really so bad? How much of a negative impact can that really have when, worst case scenario, you can just merge or delete some? A simple answer would be to direct you to the unforgivably large file size of every single one of my finished pieces, which take up so much space because of the sheer number of layers in each one that I have to store them on Google Drive just to make room for more. Another simple answer would be to make a behind-the-scenes compilation of me scrolling through layer after layer, trying to find where a certain line or shape or color adjustment is so that I can edit it because I noticed a mistake and now it's going to take me 87 years to fix it because God knows I haven't named a single layer and I have no idea which one it's on. That happens at least 25 times per piece without me ever learning my lesson about naming layers or using less of them. But both of those simple answers have simple solutions. Store big files online, name layers, learn what the word restraint means, and consider that definition when you decide whether or not to add your 93rd layer of line art that could easily be merged down into the others, but you're just not sure yet if you want to change it later and you're not ready for that kind of commitment.
I'm afraid of commitment.
How original.
Most people are familiar with these particular layer-related pet peeves, and while they acknowledge that they're definitely annoying, they generally aren't annoying enough to make the average artist actively strive to use less layers. And up until recently, I was one of them. But the longer I've spent studying, working, and experimenting as an artist, the more I've come to realize that there are other, more seriously detrimental ways in which using too many layers can hold you back as significantly as they can help you. So in today's video, I'm going to go over the many pros of layers that can be incredibly helpful to artists in moderation, the lesser known cons of too many layers that make that moderation necessary, and discuss how taking them into consideration might help you ensure that the use of layers in your creative process is as beneficial as it can be, while minimizing their more negative impacts that you might not even be entirely aware of. But first, let me take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Milanote. Milanote is an incredibly versatile tool that makes organizing creative projects so much easier, something I know that I and many other artists struggle with. Being an artist often means having a million ideas and works in progress and references all over the place, making the artistic process messy, unstructured, and often stressful as a result. With Milanote, you can change that, keeping all of your ideas, inspirations, references, and more all in one place. One project I've had on the back burner for a while now because I didn't even know where to start with everything I had to do for it is an art zine based on Japanese street fashion. But as you can see here, Milanote let me take all of those overwhelming, unorganized ideas I had for it and make them make sense. Over here, we have a to-do list where I've been able to break down the most important things I need to get done so I can make a real plan to get started. Here, I've made a list of all the major fashion subgenres I want to include in the zine, so I don't miss any when gathering reference and planning pieces. And speaking of gathering reference, that is one of my favorite things about using Milanote. There is nothing more important than keeping your inspirations and references organized and in one place so that you can make the most use out of each one in your work, which is why I've created multiple subboards for each type. I use fashion design games like Fashion Dreamer and Love Nikki to create custom references for this project, and you can see that I've made subboards specific to each one so that I can find and consult those references easily and quickly. Tokyo Fashion is another great resource I've been consulting, which has its own similar subboard here. Mood boards for specific types of clothing and accessories are over here, which were all exceptionally easy to make by using some of their many versatile templates and the web clipper tool, which lets you save images and links directly to your boards. I've also left myself little reminder notes that you can see all over my boards and subboards, because you can draw right on it and easily drag and drop not just text notes, but columns, lists, links, and more. I've been using Milanote for a while now, and I know firsthand how much easier it makes it to streamline your creative process, save time by organizing your ideas, projects, and resources, and easily share your board with others if you're working with a team. And best of all, it's actually free. Not a free trial, there is no time limit at all. All you have to do is click the link in the description and sign up, and start your next creative project with Milanote, because it's genuinely an exceptional tool for anyone, especially artists. Thank you so much to Milanote for sponsoring this video. It is always a pleasure, and again, please go check them out via the link below. All that out of the way, let's get into the video. First, naturally, we should go over the many benefits that layers offer artists, because there wouldn't be so many of us profusely overusing them if they weren't so ridiculously useful. The first, which I already touched on briefly, is the simplest and potentially the most universally utilized. With layers, it's very easy to keep your sketch, line art, and colors separate. Each artist has their own unique preferences when it comes to how many layers they use and what elements they do decide to keep separate, but the vast majority tend to separate at least those three because of just how handy it is to do so. With layers, you don't need to worry about erasing or cleaning up your sketch when it comes time to line it. You can just make a new layer on top of it, lower the opacity of your sketch layer, and create your line art independent from that sketch and discard it afterwards once you're satisfied with your lines. Some artists do prefer to clean their sketches directly into their line art, as they prefer both that type of creative process and that visual style, but even they usually keep colors separate, at least for the first while. That's because color, too, can be added on layers underneath the line art, meaning you don't have to worry about precisely filling anything in or messing up your lines by coloring over them, since they're separate altogether. It also means you can change those colors easily without affecting your line art at all, and revise and add to your line art without affecting your colors. What's more, individual elements with different colors can all be kept separate, meaning that if you want to, you can keep your character's skin, hair, clothing, and more all on their own layers independent from each other, so that each one can be revised without affecting the others. Keeping elements like that on separate layers has another benefit as well, which brings me to the next pro of layer use that's very much worth mentioning: clipping masks. Most digital art programs allow artists to make use of a tool called a clipping mask, which essentially lets you attach new layers to existing layers in terms of what they can affect. For example, if your character's skin is on one layer, you can create new layers above that skin layer and switch them from regular layers to clipping mask layers, which means that anything you draw on them will only affect the layer that they're clipped to. This allows you to add shading, highlights, textures, and pretty much anything you want to specific elements of your art without affecting others at all, meaning that rather than worrying that the shading you apply to a character's skin will get on their clothing or working extra hard to avoid that outcome by carefully shading within your lines, you can feel free to let your shading get all over the place with the knowledge that only only the parts on the skin will actually be visible. This also allows you to do things like color your line art, add fabric textures or patterns to particular pieces of clothing, or nature textures to foliage elements in the background, apply color corrections and layer modes to specific areas alone rather than the entire piece, and so much more. And that last one, layer modes, is actually the next pro on the list that I also briefly mentioned earlier. Layer modes, if you're unfamiliar, are types of layers with special properties unique to each one that aren't present in their normal counterparts. For example, here's a normal layer with this shade of red. On top of it, I'll add a clipping mask layer that's set to multiply, one of the most common layer modes. Using the same shade of red, you can see that strokes made on this layer are, as a result of the layer mode, a darker version of the base color despite me using that base color to draw them. Luminosity and Scream, conversely, do the same but with lighter shades. Overlay, more uniquely, sort of combines Multiply and Scream, shifting the midtones of the base tone depending on the color that you use on the overlay layer. There are many different layer modes to use and experiment with a variety of different versatile effects, which allow you to achieve many useful artistic outcomes with vastly less time and effort than it would have taken to do so manually. Multiply and Luminosity, respectively, allow you to bypass the need to pick a color to shade or highlight with, automatically turning the base color into a highlight or shadow of itself. Overlay does allow you to pick those colors yourself, but have them blend more effectively into the base tones with less clashing. Oh, another fun example. Have you ever drawn a character with something like a piece of clothing that has multiple colors on it? Like, if a sweater with a multicolored pattern on it needs to be shaded, areas of shadow and light will be the same for every color, but the shade you use for each one would need to be different. If a sweater is blue with pink polka dots, the areas that should be shaded or highlighted are the same on both the blue and pink areas, but if you shade them all with a darker blue, the polka dots are obviously going to look wrong because they should be shaded with a darker shade of pink. You have a few options here to fix that. One, you can shade the whole sweater with one color on its own layer and then add a clipping mask to that, where you color over the shading on the polka dots with the correct shade instead. Two, you could keep both colors on separate layers and shade them separately, trying to keep them consistent in terms of rendering placement as best you can. Or three, you could use a layer mode like Multiply to shade both with one color, because the mode will automatically turn whatever color you're using into a darker version of each one respectively, saving you massive amounts of time. And honestly, all of that's just the beginning when it comes to the technical benefits that layers offer. They're so versatile that no explanation I could give here would adequately summarize every artistic effect that they could help you achieve if utilized correctly. There's opacity, which lets you toggle how transparent or opaque a layer is on a scale of 1 to 100% to easily create a variety of different effects, from easy transparent glass to the variation of the intensity of overlaid textures. Then there's Alpha Lock. For as long as a layer is set to Alpha Lock, anything you draw on it will only affect the areas of that layer that aren't currently transparent. So if you've got this circle here without Alpha Lock, drawing directly on that layer will also affect everything else behind it. Setting it to Alpha Lock like this means all strokes made while it's set to it will only affect that circle. On the tools end of things, there are so many benefits to the use of layers that I could go on for another half hour at least without getting past the tip of the iceberg. I'll link some other videos in the description if you want to learn more about how to best utilize the majority of them, but I won't go further into it myself here because that really isn't the point of this video. The point is that when it comes to technical tools that can be used to create a versatile array of different artistic effects in your work, layers offer so many that it's no surprise they're so popular. But even then, that's just on the technical end. The psychological end is worth mentioning before I move on too. A lot of artists have a lot of anxiety when it comes to making mistakes in their work, largely out of fear that they'll ruin a piece by permanently committing to a creative choice that they don't end up liking. Whether it's the worry that you'll mess up your line art by using a new brush or line weight, or drawing over a perfect line with a wrong one. You'll ruin your colors by shading with the wrong one. You'll add a color correction or a texture that doesn't work with the piece. Whatever. There's no end to the possible anxieties an artist could have when it comes to committing to any part of their artistic process. With layers, those anxieties are effectively gone because none of those choices are permanent. If an artist doesn't like how a certain choice they've made in a piece makes it look, but it's on its own layer, all they have to do is toggle its visibility or delete it altogether, and it's like that choice was never made at all. The piece is completely unaffected by any changes that you made to it via additional layers, so you never need to worry about committing to one and risking permanently ruining all of the work that you've already put into your art. As I mentioned earlier, artists often use layers as long-term undo states. With the undo tool, you can return a piece to how it looked directly before the last few things you did to it. If you do those things to it on separate layers, it doesn't matter when you do them. You're not limited to undoing them directly after doing them. You can spend hours experimenting with all of them and then have the freedom to undo all of that work as needed, regardless of what order that work was done in, simply by removing the layers it was done on. It allows artists complete, absolute freedom to experiment in their work without committing to anything at all, which makes the creative process so much less stressful for so many artists who utilize layers this way. All of that so far is to say that the benefits of using layers aren't just numerous, they're so flexible and abundant that no matter what your particular creative process entails, they will have something to offer you that streamlines it in no small way. They're potentially one of the most enticing features that digital art programs have to offer by way of that versatility alone, which is, as I've said, why so many artists end up using so many of them. But like any good thing, too much of it eventually becomes bad, something that many artists like myself have come to learn the hard way after years of using way too many layers in their work. That in mind, let's finally move on to the cons of using layers in your work, both when it comes to using too many and becoming too reliant on them as a feature altogether. The first and most obvious downside is one that I've already mentioned briefly earlier in the video, the organizational detriments. Technically, it is really easy to organize your layers. You can name each one and keep them in neatly arranged folders, making it incredibly easy to find any layer you're looking to work on or revise, simply by opening the designated folder and consulting easily readable titles to find the right one. Technically, everything about digital art programs makes organization very easy to achieve with user-friendly tools and simple renaming options and drag and drop folders, but most artists don't use them. And we can't blame layers for this. We can't blame the programs. We can only blame ourselves and our hubris. But regardless of who or what is responsible for it, most artists do neglect organization more and more with every layer we add. I don't remember the last time I named a layer or made a folder, and more often than not, I don't even merge them down responsibly. If I'm doing line art, I usually have about 5 to 10 layers of it so that each one doesn't mess up the one below it. And more if I think I might want to color some lines later and not others. Realistically, I should be merging them all into one big line art layer once I'm done, but do I do that? No, I put it off and forget, and end up with clumps of random lines and effects and color corrections and textures in completely random orders with no organization. So if I want to change any of them, I have to frantically sift through hundreds of unnamed layers with no semblance of order to them to find which ones have the things I want to revise on them. This is the most commonly experienced downside to using too many layers, and is one that's completely avoidable if you deliberately choose to be more organized and disciplined about the way you use them. So I won't dwell on it for too much longer, since it's one that's very easily resolved if you put in the effort to do so. The next downside of layer use pertains primarily to how an over-reliance on them can leave both your skills and your confidence in a state of gradually increasing disrepair. As I mentioned when we were going over the pros, using things like multiply, overlay, or luminosity layer modes often means bypassing the need to pick the right color to use to shade or highlight your base colors. While handy, this can lead to two potentially negative outcomes. One, the colors might not look as good as they would if you had picked them yourself. Layer modes don't magically generate the right color to shade or highlight with any consideration for the overall tone of the piece, neighboring elements, or universal light sources. They combine the color you're using with the color on the layer below it based solely on the specifications designated by its mode, which doesn't always give you the right color for the piece. Using multiply and luminosity on this red using the base color alone looks relatively flat and wouldn't factor in what would look best with the rest of the piece taken into consideration. Relying entirely on those layer modes without taking those other factors into consideration yourself may leave you with flatter, less visually appealing or compelling rendering as a result. It's a problem that you can resolve by utilizing your own understanding of color theory to pick different colors than just the base color when using layer modes, but that relies on you having that understanding in the first place, which brings me to the second potential downside of becoming too reliant on layer modes in your rendering. You might either not develop it in the first place, or practice it so little that it gradually diminishes. Layer modes are not a substitute for the development of an understanding of color theory. You need to learn what hues and tones to use for shadow and light depending on the individual colors present, the piece's primary light sources, the colors of neighboring objects, the tone of the overall piece, and numerous other factors. Layer modes should be used as tools to make it easier for you to translate your existing understanding of those factors into easier rendering, not substitutes for that understanding altogether. Multiply layers should be used to make shading easier for an artist that knows they should use blue tones on them to shade the base color of red based on the piece's tone. Not a way for an artist to bypass the need to learn what color to shade with because they can just set it to multiply and have the base color of red be darker, even if that doesn't end up looking as good. Layer modes, when used right, are tools that make it easier for artists to apply their existing knowledge more effectively. When used wrong or too much, they encourage artists not to acquire that knowledge in the first place, because they don't need to if layers will generate the effects that they want regardless. Whether it's detrimental or not depends entirely on how you approach it. If you develop your skills and understanding first and practice them, and and then use layers to empower you to utilize them better, there's no detriment to them at all. If you use them to avoid needing to learn those skills in the first place, your artistic growth will end up stunted to some degree as a result, either deteriorating gradually or not being developed at all to begin with. Layers offer so many useful tools that they expedite every aspect of the creative process, but they're so powerful that artists run the risk of using them as alternatives to developing their skills rather than tools with which to get the most use out of them. But while I've now covered how over-reliance on layers can be detrimental to the development of your skills, I also mentioned earlier that it can be just as detrimental to your confidence. So let's talk about how. In the pros of layers section, we went over how beneficial they can be when it comes to allowing artists the freedom to experiment without anxiety. If every artistic choice, revision, and addition is kept on its own layer, an artist doesn't have to commit to any of them, and that does empower them to try out new techniques without fear or worry about them turning out poorly and being permanently stuck with them anyway. But in many cases, this is almost like riding an artistic bike with training wheels. Because you don't have to commit to any particular artistic choice, you might end up feeling overwhelmed by potential options without knowing which ones to commit to. Without the obligation to stick with any artistic decision you've experimented with, it can become increasingly difficult to choose which ones you want to permanently implement. It's easy to get caught up in the experimentation process with a million different options on separate layers that you've tried out, and then lose confidence in your ability to determine which ones to keep and which ones to discard. The more options you give yourself to choose from, the harder it becomes to tell which ones work with each other and the piece as a whole, and the more difficulty you may end up having when it comes to committing to any artistic decisions at all. I've ended up finishing pieces and spending hours experimenting with different color correction layers, texture layers, line art color layer revisions, and so on, to the point that I sincerely couldn't tell what looked better or worse than the original anymore. Interestingly, every time I end up showing my wife the original and then the multiple versions I revised through hours worth of experimentation with way too many adjustment layers, she always prefers the original. That isn't to say that using a bunch of adjustment layers never makes a piece better, because that's just not true, but it is a warning that using too many can make it increasingly difficult to be confident in which ones actually work and improve upon the piece and which ones don't. Because you don't have to commit to any artistic choices and you're free to experiment with all potential options at your disposal thanks to the versatile tools that layers offer, your confidence when it comes to committing to any of them at all might wane. After all, if you've got 30 different versions of the same piece thanks to different combinations of different layers, it's gonna be really hard and overwhelming to objectively decide which one looks best and why. Layers can quite simply make you too powerful, and there may just come a point where you need to nerf yourself. And that's not the only instance in which that's the case either, bringing me to the final detriment of layer use that was what motivated me to make this video in the first place when I realized how much it was holding me back: the restriction of separation. Because you can, if you so choose, keep every single aspect of your piece on its own layer, it can be very tempting to do just that, especially if you struggle with confidence as an artist. If you're not particularly confident in your skills and anticipate that you'll make a lot of mistakes, it makes sense for you to keep as many things separate via layers as possible, since that allows you to fix those mistakes without having them permanently affect the rest of the piece. If you're shading a character's skin with 3 different tones, it can be tempting to keep each one on its own layer. After all, if you've already applied the base shadow and the secondary shadow, and you're not confident enough to think that you can apply the third without messing it up, it makes sense to do so on a layer above them where those inevitable mistakes can be easily revised without any bearing on what you've already completed. But while that too can be comforting and useful as a form of artistic training wheel, there comes a time when training wheels hold you back more than they empower you. You'll never learn to be confident enough to shade with all 3 on one layer if you never force yourself to try, and it can be tempting not to bother to if layers make doing so unnecessary. And to be fair, it wouldn't be unreasonable of you to then ask, well, so what? Why do the training wheels need to come off at all? How is it really holding anyone back to keep using them? The answer is that while separating every element into individual layers seems like a harmless form of training wheel that offers the freedom to render each one without fear of making mistakes, the endless freedom it offers doubles as a form of restriction that holds you back in 2 primary ways. The first is on a technical level. Returning to our previous example, if you're shading and highlighting a character's skin with several separate tones and hues, and keeping each one on its own layer, it does protect each one from being messed up by the others. But in reality, those tones aren't separate from each other. They blend into and interact with each other in a way that you can only effectively depict if you allow the tones that you use in your coloring to interact with each other too. Something that can't happen if they're all on separate layers. They can't be blended directly into each other or influence each other as they would in reality if they're all kept entirely restricted from each other. There are other instances in which this is true as well. For example, imagine a character that's in an environment where they're lit from one primary light source. Every part of them, from their skin to their hair to their clothing, will be affected by that light source in the same way, with the same areas of light and shadow resulting from that interaction. But if you keep every aspect of the character on individual layers, it can result in those aspects being rendered without that consistency, with each each element appearing less like an aspect of the character or environment as a whole and more as its own disjointed object. What I mean is that in my experience, I used to separate every single element of a character into its own layer to be rendered individually. Not just skin, hair, and clothing, but literally everything that was a different color than something else. A character's jacket would have separate layers for the base color, any buttons or zippers, any patterns of different colors, and any small details. Any piece of clothing they were wearing followed the same rule. So even if everything was a part of the same piece of clothing, every single part would be separated if it wasn't the same color or material. This applied to everything from characters to backgrounds, to the point that I would have upwards of 50 base color layers alone before starting the rendering process at all and adding infinitely more. Yes, this allowed me to choose individual shades and hues to render with for each object of a different color, and it kept mistakes on one aspect from affecting any other one. But what I failed to realize was that it was also holding me back by keeping them from looking cohesive. Yes, areas of shadow should be shaded with different tones based on their different base colors, but those tones should all still work together because they're all in the same environment being affected by each other. When I was rendering everything separately based on what color they were, I was neglecting to acknowledge that that wasn't all there was to consider. A character's hair, skin, jacket, shirt, and pants may all be different colors and subsequently need to be shaded with different colors, but they're all still lit by the same light source in the same environment. Because I was rendering them all on separate layers, they ended up all looking like separate objects in separate environments. Colors were too different from each other based on their base colors rather than the colors of the environment and the whole piece, leading to disjointed and inconsistent rendering where nothing really matched or came together as if it was all part of one thing. In reality, a bunch of colors lit by the same source will share tones and colors as a result of interacting with the same environment and with each other. Reflective light from one object will affect the color of another. The color of the light source will be similar in areas of high intensity, regardless of each object's base color, and so on. When I started merging all of a character's base colors into one layer and then rendering all of them at once, they suddenly looked much more consistent because I was considering the way that light and shadow interacted with entire forms rather than individual elements, and getting caught up in minute details because those details were on their own layers. Restricting everything into its own layer feels like freedom on the surface, but when it comes to maintaining consistency throughout a piece and creating an environment in which everything in the piece feels like a part of the same world rather than a mishmash of different elements from different sources, it can do much more harm than good. You don't want your piece to look like a mishmash of different environments where it seems like your character's shirt is lit from one source in one setting, their pants in another, and they themselves in still another. And separating each into individual layers can result in exactly that. I will say that if you struggle with this but you don't want to stop separating every single aspect into individual layers, that is not your only option. You could also consider rendering each part separately as you already were if you were doing what I was, assuming that's your preferred process, completing that piece that way, exporting it as a PNG, and then adding new layers over that combined flattened PNG where you apply global shading and highlights that bring the whole thing together as one more cohesive piece. It doesn't necessarily work quite as well as if you'd rendered them that way with that vision in mind in the first place, but it does definitely reduce the impact of that disjointed, inconsistent appearance. The other downside resulting from layer-based restriction, however, is just as significant, and it relates less to technique and more to time. Prior to my reconsideration of how I approach layers, I was spending massive amounts of time on each piece, simply because I had to complete each element of every single one individually. I wasn't just rendering a character and an environment, I was rendering each single separate individual aspect of every tiny detail of both, because they were all on different layers. Rendering a character alone used to take me hours because I was adding clipping masks to each specific aspect of them that happened to be a different color than the rest, and completing them each individually, which not only led to the aforementioned disjointed and inconsistent style and appearance, but also took me a ridiculous amount of time. After all, I couldn't just shade everything at once on one layer, since it would only apply to whichever one was below it, and there were a million that needed to be done one after the other, rather than one that all the shading could be applied to. Now that I render characters with every different aspect of them on one layer, it takes me about an hour tops. The same goes for backgrounds and pretty much everything, honestly. If you're like me, it started out being a confidence issue. I was afraid to make mistakes in my rendering that would affect all of the rendering I had already done underneath it, so I separated everything to minimize that risk. And then it evolved into an organizational issue where I wanted every detail to be meticulously rendered on an individual basis, even when that degree of detail and separation wouldn't actually have been accurate or realistic or necessary at all. I eventually ended up confident enough to render without fear of making mistakes, but was still so caught up in the individual details that I kept keeping everything on separate layers anyway. Over time, it made the creative process miserable and overwhelming to me because of the sheer amount of work, time, and effort that went into each piece. And I didn't even realize that that was the problem until one time, following a mentor's advice, I decided to do one piece differently. This one here. I rendered the whole background on like maybe maybe 10 layers and then the character on maybe 10 more, and suddenly felt like a weight was lifted off my shoulders to such a significant degree that I knew immediately that I had to make a video talking about it. It took a fraction of the time it would have otherwise, looked 10 times better than the previous versions that were heavily layer restricted that I ended up scrapping, and I actually enjoyed making it. I didn't realize how much layer separation had been holding me back until I took off those training wheels and suddenly realized I didn't need them anymore, and I hadn't in a long time. And really, that's what all of these downsides come down to. Knowing when you need layers to give you the support of training wheels, and learning when you don't need them to that degree anymore, and can instead start utilizing them in new ways that suit where you're at now. That's honestly the conclusion I want to leave you with after all of this discussion. Your use of layers, in my opinion, should evolve with you and your skills and your creative process as an artist, something that you should consciously and introspectively evaluate intermittently and consistently as you grow and improve. Layers are hands down one of the most beneficial, useful, appealing, versatile tools that digital art programs have to offer, and those benefits are what rightfully draws so many artists into using the hell out of them, as they absolutely should. But if you overuse them or use them in a way that hinders you more than it helps you, they can quickly become something that holds you back rather than empowering you. That doesn't mean you should stop using them by any means, and I know a lot of you listening to me will tell me that I can pry your 245 layer canvases from your cold dead hands, and I would not dream of insisting otherwise. All I will say is that from my experience, it's very much worth considering how the downsides of their overuse might impact you, because reevaluating your approach to layers in digital art periodically throughout your artistic journey might be an effective way to minimize that negative impact in a major way. But please let me know what you guys think in the comments, because I think every artist's experience with layers is probably very unique, simply because no two creative processes are the same. I know some artists use layers very differently than I do, and will subsequently have very different takes on their uses and benefits, and I'd be very interested to hear those perspectives, both out of curiosity and a personal interest in potentially reconsidering my own perspective based on them. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. Special thank you as always to channel members Joseph Solomon, TC Pratt, Zelda Deverak42, Abyss Reborn, Harky Kyle, King Good James, Cutie Sailor Lovely, Justice for Asterion, and CP Lil Thing, as well as patrons Batman, Kyle Lowe, Blue Swanson, Cora Fear, Jamisha Walker, Alengshi, Kim Yen, Crazy Asar, Gentong, Grayson Xavier, MG, Blah Mage, TC Pratt, Finn, Grim Spectre, Celine Merriman, Ash, Eldritchia, The Stray Dog, Ulura, Greg Noble, Decagon, Jenny Chan, Captain Reku, Ryan M. Williams, Catbus, Alec Reinekainen, Mac, Lucy Yamajiki, Selena Bibi, Electa Mike, Pride A, Totally Shogun, Insomniac Sleep Schedule, Lola the Pinky, Wing Wong, and Smiley Boy. And I'll see you in the next one.